could be related to everyone with your last name.
Just think if you're a Lincoln, how you'd be congratulated if Honest Abe were someone you could claim.
To clear up any mystery, just check your family history.
Genealogy's the name of the game. Now some ancestors you'll find you want to hide,
but most of them will fill your heart with pride.
Oh, your family tree, your family tree. Check your genealogy, find who was who and how who came to be. On your family tree.
Welcome, listeners. It's time for the Genealogy Radio Show from Radio Carrigtwohill, the radio station that's keeping you in the loop. And this week's show is about the 18th century historical account of the trial of James Cotter, authored by Dr. Groeger. We're most fortunate today to have Dr. Groeger on air with us to tell us about this event and how it impacted on the actors of the time. Just to give you a background to this story, students of Irish history will note that this tells of the most controversial court events in 18th century Ireland. James Cotter, a Catholic father of 4 from Carrigtwohill, was executed in 1720 for the rape of a young woman near Fermoy. The imprisonment, trial and subsequent execution sparked protests across South Munster, Dublin and beyond. He died despite calls for clemency from government representatives, the Protestant hierarchy, the jury and even his accuser. Now we're going to start by interviewing the author of The Trial of James Cotter. Kieran, you're very welcome to the Genealogy Radio Show. I know you have recently launched the book and it's on sale through Kindle version and in Stockis in Youghal. I was fascinated in how you started your research journey through the chance meeting of 2 Americans researching their ancestry. So, Kieran, how are you? And welcome to the Genealogy Radio Show.
Thank you very much indeed, Lorna. It's a pleasure to be here.
Oh, we're delighted to have you. And Kieran, just to start, who was James Cotter?
Well, James Cotter was a very, very wealthy Catholic landowner, which was most unusual in those days. His family background is remarkable. His father was Sir James Cotter. He had been knighted for his services to the King of England, and he performed a number of amazing things for the King of England, including acting as an assassin, sort of a James Bond figure for him. He was sent off to Switzerland to assassinate John Lisle, which he did.
And which king are we talking about?
We're talking about King Charles II.
Charles II.
Now, King Charles I was executed on the orders of people like Oliver Cromwell, and there was a trial and he was executed. But when his son, King Charles II, became king, he decided he would get revenge by getting anybody who was in any way involved in the killing of his father. And so he was able to round up some of the people living in England, but a number of them escaped to America, to Switzerland, to the Netherlands. And so King Charles II sent out teams of assassins to actually track these people down and kill them.
Oh, and one of those was James Cotter, obviously.
His father.
His father, yes.
Later on then the father became governor of Cork at the time of the Battle of the Boyne. He was commander-in-chief of the Southern Forces. And so when the Treaty of Limerick was actually signed, James Cotter was allowed to keep his land and his title. And that's sort of the background that we'll say the James Cotter's family. Now, he himself, the James Cotter, the man in our story, he married a girl called Margaret Mathew. Now, Margaret Mathew had a sister, Anne Mathew. Anne was married to Gareth Nagle, and they have a little child called Nano Nagle, who will be very familiar with to people as the founder of the Presentation Order. And James's wife, Margaret Mathew, again, her first cousin is George Mathew, who's the grandfather of the Father Mathew, the temperance person. And another then one of the family is married to Richard Burke. Richard Burke is the father of Edmund Burke, whose statue is outside Trinity College.
Oh, that's wonderful. And what a wonderful genealogy legacy there.
Huge, yes.
Now, as a wealthy gentleman, James Cotter got executed in 18th century Ireland. One of the questions I have here for you is, why couldn't he buy his way out of trouble?
Yeah, well, there's a small bit of understanding of the law involved, and we'll come to that later. But before it came to trial, there were several months of negotiations, and looking at the newspapers of the time, a figure of £15,000 was on the table to buy himself out of trouble. But the people who were, and it's not just one person who was prosecuting him. In those days, the girl, for example, who's bringing the accusation would be what's called the prosecutor. She's bringing the case, but in this case, she was helped by a number of people.
Okay, and we might just start. We just might start with telling us a little bit about the story. What exactly happened? What did he get accused of, and how did it happen?
It's very strangely, this man unfortunately had an eye for the ladies, and on one particular day he went drinking with a young lady, not his wife. They went to Fermoy. They had 2 bottles of wine, and when he was there in Fermoy, he gave her a present of a gold watch. She gave him a glove, and they then went on towards to they left the inn in Fermoy and headed off together, but she felt a bit unwell, got off her horse and got sick. Her servant was with her. She told James Cotter to ride on. She'd join him a few minutes later as soon as she was well. He went on, and literally they spent the night together. Now, when they were spending the night together, he asked her for the watch back and offered her £15 instead for the watch. She was very annoyed, and a week later he got a knock on the door saying this lady was saying that she was raped. That's the sort of the background to the story.
Oh, and he obviously got tried and convicted and executed.
Well, again, it's not as simple as that, because in those days, if a girl was bringing a case, she had to pay the full cost of the proceedings. So she would first of all go to the sheriff. She'd report her case. He would convene a grand jury, a bit like the American system today. There's a grand jury is called. She explains her case to the grand jury, and the first time that they heard the case, they threw it out, and they said there was absolutely nothing to it. So she then changed her story slightly, and the second time she told her story was that between Fermoy and where they spent the night, she felt a bit unwell. He pulled her from the horse, and this time the story was different. There were 2 people now, 2 witnesses who heard her, who were very worried about her, and brought her along to James Cotter, and he said no, and so on. So the story changed, and if we were to believe Jonathan Swift, who was one of the people who got involved in the story a little bit, 3 times the grand jury heard the case, and eventually they decided, look, there is a case to answer, definitely this should go to trial, and so it went to trial. But it's a different sort of a system to ours today.
Very interesting system, and one that genealogists need to take note of in the 18th century.
Yes.
But can you tell us why the authorities detested him so much that they wanted to make sure that they got him at all costs?
He didn't help himself in any way. For example, his horse was taken from him. He had a beautiful horse, and in those days there was one, the Penal Laws was there. A Catholic could not own a horse worth more than £5. So when his horse was taken from him, he used to go around in a carriage drawn by bullocks, but he used to put little orange tassels on the feet of the bullocks, so that if it was a muddy day, he would be stamping the orange flag into the ground when his bullocks were going around. He certainly took part in a number of riots against the government, riots in Tralee, riots in Dublin, and the newspapers describe him as the leader of the riots in Dublin. And so this was somebody that the authorities definitely did not like in any way. The other thing was he had a way of getting around the laws. For example, he got married at the age of 15. This was most unusual because when his father died, James was just 15. By law, he should have been taken from the family and raised as a Protestant. But the family hid him, got special permission for him to get married, and so he bypassed the law because he was now a married man. But all of these things, the authorities bit by bit began to hate him. And the person who most hated him was the Duke of Bolton, who was the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland. Now, why would he hate him in particular? Well, his wife, Duchess of Bolton, was the granddaughter of John Lisle, who was killed
executed
in Switzerland by James Cotter's father. And so there were all sorts of things like revenge coming in, and over again you get the feeling that there were a whole lot of people just literally waiting in the wings to get James Cotter if ever he slipped up, and he slipped up.
And got him, they did. But why didn't he escape abroad when,
Okay, that would have been an option for him, but the difficulty is because he's being prosecuted by a private person. In other words, Elizabeth Squibb is bringing a prosecution. If he fails to turn up, he's immediately outlawed. Now, James Cotter's grandfather was outlawed, and being outlawed means you lose your land. It means you lose everything. Your family's thrown out on the side of the street. And in this case, if he did that, he would also be acknowledging his guilt. And he actually believed strongly he was not guilty of rape. He was guilty of marital infidelity, but that's not rape. And so he wanted to face his accuser. He wanted to actually give his story in court because he felt he definitely would be vindicated in court. So doing a runner abroad wasn't an option, although at the end of the night before he was executed, he did try to do a runner, but it was too late at that stage.
And there was a plea for clemency, there was loads of stuff. But
well, the jury unanimously asked that he not be hanged, which was most unusual in those days. The Lord Chief Justice of Ireland felt there wasn't enough evidence there to hang him. There were all sorts of, the girl herself just didn't want the execution to go forward. She felt that getting a guilty verdict was more than enough for her good name to be re-established. She was quite happy with that. So that all over the place, several of the lords, people, the entire community, Protestant and Catholic in the Cork area, pleaded for his life. But literally, there was no way the authorities would relent in any way. They wanted him hanged.
And what was the aftermath after his execution?
All sorts of strange things happened. I mean, first of all, in the case of James Cotter, his two boys would have been taken from the mother and raised as Protestants. One of them, who was also called James, becomes a member of Parliament for Askeaton, County Limerick, and for the rest of until the present day, those Cotters are Protestants, and those Cotters, we'll say, have kept within that establishment thinking. James Cotter's wife was so frightened she changed religion, and a couple of years later she did remarry. The solicitor, he had a solicitor, Richard Burke changed religion and burnt all papers to do with the story. It frightened people an awful lot what actually, what happened to him, because people could see that an innocent man could actually be hanged if the authorities decided they wanted to do it. So there were riots then in Cork, in Dublin. There was one particularly nasty series of attacks on Elizabeth Squibb when she went to Dublin. But in fact, the Quakers were caught up in the story, and anybody who looked like a Quaker was attacked for weeks after the event. It was a major thing, so much so that in fact some of the Squibbs who were Quakers left the country, and within 50 years there wasn't any one of them, not one member of the family left in Ireland.
Oh, so it had a major, but it really shows the effect of the penal laws, which we rarely hear about sometimes with genealogy and bits and pieces.
They led immediately to the famine. I mean, it was not immediately, but within 150 years, we have the Great Famine in Ireland, and it is a direct. One particular law, which was the law to prevent the further development of popery, it was called, that particular law stipulated that when a Catholic man died, his farm had to be divided equally among his sons, unless one of the sons became a Protestant, in which case he would get the entire farm. Now, that law meant that bit by bit, generation by generation, every Catholic farm got smaller and smaller and smaller. And so, by the time we move on 6 generations, we have tiny, tiny holdings, tiny farms, people barely on the breadline. People, if the potatoes fail, they're going to die in their thousands and thousands. And that particular law to prevent the growth of popery is the one that leads directly to our famine.
Oh yes, that is a very interesting point. And I know the book is on sale on Kindle,
Yes.
and it's available in stockists as well. But what does it tells us about 18th century genealogy research, which is fascinating, because that's how you started, really, isn't
Absolutely.
it?
Well, you see, for the most part, most people can manage the 20th century, the 19th century. The 18th century is a little bit more difficult, but we're actually, in the case of this particular story, I was very, very fortunate. The Lord Chief Justice of Ireland is a man called Broderick. His son was the judge in the case. And there are thousands of letters written by the Brodericks over the years that have now been gathered in an archive in Reading, in England, and a lot of these are online. I was able to get them. There are other parts of the archive in Cork I was able to see. The Cotter papers are in the National Library in Ireland. Equally then, one of the people who actually attended the trial was a man called Arthur St. Ledger, and he wrote 3 letters about the actual trial, and again they're actually in the public record in Northern Ireland, Prony, and you can actually get those quite easily. There are newspaper accounts of the event, and there's a lovely book which you'll get in libraries. It's called Newsplan, and it just tells you exactly what newspapers are available for any particular date for any particular county. So you can actually you can get the stuff. You won't get very often births, marriages, deaths as easily as you would for, say, the 20th century, but you can arrive at the story by looking at things like wills, by looking at land, the registry of deeds, by looking at the newspaper accounts. You can actually get the story. And then in this particular case, because the Quakers were involved, the Quakers have the most wonderful set of archives in Rathfarnham in Dublin, but there are microfilms available in many of the libraries that you can access. But their records of births, marriages, deaths are superb. I wanted to look also at they had parliamentary committees and other minutes. I wanted to see a bit more about how they actually worked in order to see how they got caught up in the story. But you can get there are archives, and there are newspaper accounts, so that it is possible to actually access the 18th century, not as easily, but it's definitely possible.
That's absolutely brilliant, and this is of huge interest to our listeners abroad, because they often feel 19th century can't go back any further than that. What sources do we use? Are sources like this easy to obtain? And you've really explained, well, the newspapers and other sources like that are the ones to use, and archives that are frequently now being put online, listeners, are really, really important, because they're being digitized as we speak, they're put online. And are they easy to obtain then, or understand, or do you have to be an expert in transcribing?
Not really. I mean, in the case, say, of the Quaker Archives, which was the reason I mentioned the Quaker Archives was that the first time I heard the story, it was that it was to do with the Quaker history of Cork, and they were saying that this particular man was hanged because he was supposed to have raped a woman who was supposed to have been a Quaker, but she wasn't. But I had to check all their records. But they have incredibly detailed records of everyone who's born, people who die, and also records of their meetings. And it's their meetings are the critical ones. Who was attending meetings, what kind of meetings. And taking, for example, at the time of the trial of James Cotter, there was a special parliamentary committee. They were meeting the government to discuss getting special freedom for Quakers, and an act of tolerance, it was called. Now, that act of tolerance was granted to the Quakers, strangely enough, at the same time as James Cotter was being executed. So the Catholics were on a downward spiral in terms of intolerance, if you like, but the Quakers were being tolerated. They were able to become free men. They didn't have to take an oath of allegiance, because people accepted they weren't, that they didn't do oaths, etc. But you can read these, and they're very easy to read, beautiful handwriting. And one of them is in the case of the Cork and Munster Quakers, is a man called Thomas White, has actually a book written on the sufferings of Quakers, and of course, who was believed to be responsible for the sufferings of Quakers in the Cork area was the governor of Cork, James Cotter.
Oh, so it's all a plot. Well, after James's execution, what happened to this branch of the Cotter family, for instance? How did branches end up in America?
Okay, first of all, the 2 boys were taken away and raised as Protestants. So that particular, we'll say, the male side of the Cotter name disappeared completely into the Protestant, we'll say, branch of things. There were 2 daughters, but they would lose the name anyway. Now, James had a brother, Lawrence, but Lawrence and the other Cotters all seemed to go towards West Cork. Inchigeelagh was a very famous place, and for some reason there, they seem to have acquired a nickname, Woodsmen, because a lot of them from then on become called Sylvester Cotter. There are a number of Sylvester Cotters appear in the books, but the easiest thing for them to do was to get out of the country, get away from the trouble, because certainly this story, it frightened the life out of people, though, how powerful a government could be, that they could take an innocent person and literally have him hanged, despite the evidence against him, if you like. The evidence wasn't there to hang him, when the Lord Chief Justice himself says it wasn't there. But so a lot of Cotters would emigrate to America, for literally to be safer over there in a new life. But equally, people emigrated because the penal laws were so punitive that it wasn't possible to have a life in Ireland.
Yes, or a life with used to the standard of living. They would have to descend into the ranks of peasantry.
Absolutely.
And what is the most unusual part of the research uncovered? What surprised you the most?
Well, the first thing that surprised me, that was my first time writing any kind of a serious historical piece, was how inaccurate so many accounts from historians were, and that I had to literally check sources again and again and again to get any sense of what actually did happen. That was kind of I was amazed at how easily people would say made assumptions based on their own point of view. That surprised me. But I was actually delighted to actually get to find how easy it was, and how much cooperation and how willing people were to help. People like, say, genealogists who were extraordinarily helpful with their time and checking things out when I would say that I wouldn't necessarily have the skill to do. I was delighted to actually get that kind of help. I was delighted also to find the Jonathan Swift connection. I would say nothing I had ever read about the case suggested that Jonathan Swift was involved. And to find somebody like Jonathan Swift, the Gulliver's Travels writer, to find him writing about the story, to find his poems, so to find how much of his life was caught up in his writings, that was absolutely wonderful for me. I suppose I found that literally people. I suppose the best thing to say is how helpful everybody was. I went to the Quakers, and I was literally going to be contradicting the history of the Quakers, which said they had nothing to do with it. And in the research, I actually found evidence that they had an awful lot to do with it.
Yes, and it shows you how religion is being used as a means of upward mobility at the time. You see the same with the Huguenots. I was at a talk there a couple of weeks ago, and it was fascinating how they were able to use the means of religion as a vehicle to gain credence and really, really move upward and gain the valuable resources that were the remnants of the lands left over by the wealthy Catholics in 1709,
but
and so
they
on.
weren't as much of a threat either, as the Catholics would always have been seen as a threat, and whereas the Huguenots coming in from France would have been seen as much more loyal. Quakers coming in as Cromwellian soldiers would have been seen as loyal. The people mightn't have liked their religion, but they would have seen them as far more loyal subjects than, say, the Catholics.
Well, this has been a most fascinating interview, and I just want you to tell me a little bit about what's happening in Youghal for our remaining few minutes here. You're involved in the Youghal, the wonderful Youghal Through the Ages, as it was when I went down there, but it's now in its 13th year, I understand.
Well, we take a topic every year, and we have organised a conference. So this year we're organising a conference on the Fitzgerald dynasty, and we're picking the Fitzgerald dynasty because up the river from Youghal there is the beautiful Dromana House.
That's right.
And Dromana is celebrating 800 years of the Fitzgerald family living in Dromana. Now the Fitzgeralds, at one stage there wasn't a son, so instead it became the Villiers-Stewart family, and they're still there all the way through. So there's an unbroken line of 800 years. So we're going to celebrate that, and a number of things happened this year as well. Well, sorry, in the last 12 months. part of the church of St Mary's in Youghal collapsed, and we found a crypt to Sir John Fitzgerald. And so we'll have the archaeologist coming along to explain, but we also will have a genealogist explaining who exactly was Sir John Fitzgerald.
That's fantastic.
And so we'll tie in. We'll also then look at somebody like Pierce McGarrett, who was an Irish poet, and unfortunately he talks in one of his poems about going up the road. In other words, his father became a Protestant in order to keep the land, that sort of thing. So we're going to be looking at Fitzgerald.
And when is the conference on, Kieran?
It's on in the third week in September, the
and
weekend.
Also there's a celebration of Dramana 800. I'm involved in it with the one-on-one consultations, and I've got a team of genealogists, Anne-Marie Coughlin, Eileen O'Doul, Maura Kiley, and so on, and we'll be doing one-on-one consultations, and some of these are online, so it's going to be a great event. Now, Kieran, our time has beaten us, so thank you so much for your time today, and we're going to put a link up for Dr. Groeger's book, and it's also a wonderful read, and we're also putting an app up of Youghal as well under the talk, so that'll be podcast directly after the show, and I'm very happy to have had you on. You were a wonderful interview, and thanks very much for your time.
Thank you very much indeed, Lorna.
You're very welcome. And to conclude for today, all the shows are now podcasts, so you can gain access at the Radio Corcabashkin website, rcb.ie. Thanks for listening, and tell your friends and relatives about the Genealogy Radio Show, keeping you in the loop.
Did you ever stop and wonder if you could be related to everyone with your last name?
Just think if you're a Lincoln, how you'd be congratulated if Honest Abe were someone you could claim.
To clear up any mystery, just check your family history.
Genealogy's the name of the game. Now some ancestors you'll find you want to hide,
but most of them will fill your heart with pride.
Oh, your family tree, your family tree. Check your genealogy, find who was who and how who came to be. On your family tree.